The wind ripped through the cascade pines like it had teeth, tearing snow from the branches and flinging it into the air in fine, blinding sheets. Jack Delaney adjusted the grip on his old rifle, lowering his body instinctively as he moved across the ridge. The ground beneath his boots was a frozen crust, cracking faintly under pressure. Behind him, his German shepherd, Bear, padded silently, 10 years old, scarred, proud, and always 2 steps ahead. They weren't out for sport. Jack didn't kill for trophies. He was tracking a lone mule deer not to fill a freezer, but to keep himself and Bear sharp. Since retiring from the army 7 years ago, silence had been both friend and punishment. Bear, once a combat K9 trained in detection and rescue, had aged out of service but never stopped watching Jack like he was waiting for a command. Tonight, Bear was acting strange. Jack noticed it just after they crossed the creek bed east of Thornback Ridge. The dog froze, his tail stiffened, ears forward. No bark, just a low rumble, barely audible over the wind. Jack raised a hand out of habit, signaling Bear to stay low, but the shepherd was already moving. Fast, darting off trail and into the snow-heavy underbrush without hesitation. Jack hissed a curse and followed. His body still obeyed the muscle memory of combat, moving swiftly, rifle angled downward, eyes sweeping ahead. He had no idea what Bear had seen or sensed, but he'd learned to trust the dog more than he trusted most men. He reached a narrow cut in the ridge and found Bear halfway down a slope, standing completely still over something sprawled in the snow. Number 2 somethings. Jack slid down, boots carving deep tracks in the powder. When he reached Bear, the air punched out of him. 2 men lay on the ground, both in uniform, both bleeding. The first man was slumped sideways, eyes barely open, one hand clamped over his stomach. His patrol jacket was soaked dark from mid-chest to hip, a deep red that still spread slowly across the snow. The second man wasn't moving. Flat on his back, pale face tilted towards the sky, mouth slightly open. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and blood pooled beneath his head. Bear had curled his body close against the man's chest, trying to keep in what little warmth remained. The shepherd didn't whimper or move, he just lay there like a living shield. Jack knelt beside the conscious one. Latino, early 30s. His badge was missing, but his radio mic still clung to his collar. Deputy, judging by the navy jacket. Jack leaned close. "Hey, you with me?" The man's lips parted, voice no more than a rasp. Don't call it in." Jack's brow tightened. "You're shot and your partner's half frozen. They'll find us." A cough rattled in the deputy's chest. "They know." Maddox knew where we'd be. Jack's gut twisted. The name hit him like a slap, but he said nothing. He looked down at the unconscious. Man, white, late 30s. Officer, not deputy. No rank pin. His service weapon was still holstered, untouched. The blood trail told a story. They hadn't fired. They'd been ambushed, hunted. Bear shifted slightly, pressing harder into the man's ribcage. The way he watched Jack, still alert. It was like the dog already understood the entire damn situation. Jack stood, scanning the tree line. No movement, but the wind carried something sharp in the air, like metal and rot. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature was dropping fast. "You're not dying out here," Jack muttered. "Either of you." He grabbed the emergency tarp from his pack, tore off the straps, and fashioned a makeshift sled. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. He lifted the unconscious man first, barely onto the sled, teeth clenched with effort. Bear stayed beside the deputy, licking his face lightly, just enough to keep him responsive. Before leaving, Bear moved toward a tree near the trail and began digging. Jack followed and saw what the shepherd had uncovered, a torn strip of black fabric. The edges were scorched. It looked like part of a balaclava, standard issue for tactical ops. Bear dropped it at Jack's feet, staring up with eyes that said, "This matters." Jack stuffed it into his coat pocket. He didn't understand the full picture yet, but Bear clearly did. It took an hour to drag both men to the cabin, a modest log structure tucked deep in the woods, solar-powered and mostly forgotten. Jack had built it for peace. But peace had never stayed long in his life. By the time he kicked the door open, both men were shivering violently. Jack stoked the fire hard, boiling water, laying out the emergency blankets. He cut away their jackets, checked for wounds. One bullet to the gut, one head trauma, and likely a broken femur. He'd seen worse. He'd survived worse. But out here there was no backup, just him. And Bear. The cabin flickered in firelight. Jack worked quickly, sewing, cleaning, wrapping. Bear moved between the men like a medic on duty, his body never far from the heat source. Every so often, he would lift his head and stare at the door, as if he knew someone else was coming. Around 1 a.m., the deputy stirred again. Jack leaned in. "What's your name?" "Luis. Ramos." "And the other guy?" "Sergeant Warner. Eric Warner." Luis swallowed hard. "They set us up. Told us it was a dead-end drop spot. No backup, just recon. Who's they?" Luis opened his eyes, pain thick in them. "Maddox. He's in charge of the Special Narcotics Division now. He sent us out there, the name again." Maddox Jack hadn't heard it in over a decade, not since the desert, not since that mission that got 3 good men killed and Jack sent home with a scar under his collar and an honorable discharge wrapped in silence. Bear let out a low growl, not at anyone in the room, but toward the window. Jack followed his gaze. Outside the wind howled, but something had changed. Someone was watching. And Bear knew it. Luis Ramos drifted in and out of consciousness, teeth chattering as Jack packed gauze into the wound on his side. The blood loss was bad, but not fatal if kept warm and still. Across the room, Eric Warner remained motionless, his breathing shallow, face pale against the firelight. His leg had begun to swell. Jack had splintered it with a broom handle and 3 strips torn from his spare flannel, but it was only a stopgap. He needed a hospital. Hell, they both did. But the words Luis whispered kept echoing in Jack's head. "Don't call it in. They'll come back to finish us off." Bear sat beside the door, still as a statue, eyes locked on the frosted window. Jack followed his gaze, but saw only the blur of falling snow. Outside, the world had gone quiet again, but Bear didn't move. His ears twitched every few seconds, as if tracking a sound no one else could hear. "You're serious about this?" Jack asked, crouching next to Luis. "They shot you, left you for dead. And you think they're monitoring emergency comms?" Luis nodded weakly. "They used encrypted bands. Gear with no markings, but they knew our route, knew where we'd be. Maddox told us to go light. No comms, no backup." Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved to the pile of equipment he'd stripped off their bodies earlier and pulled Luis's vest back into his lap. Bear padded over and began sniffing at the seams again, moving with focus. Jack turned the vest over. One edge, near the collar, had stitching that looked newer than the rest. Bear let out a small grunt and nosed the spot. Jack reached in and peeled back the lining with a penknife. A small black USB drive fell into his palm, wrapped in electrical tape. "What's this?" Luis's eyes fluttered open. "Evidence. Photos. Audio. We were building a case." I think Maddox found out Jack stood, tucked the drive into a jar on the mantel. He moved quietly to the door, unlatched it, and stepped onto the porch with Bear behind him. The cold was biting. Snow had accumulated another inch in the past hour, softening the outlines of the path he'd dragged the men down earlier. The woods were quiet, but not calm. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Then Bear's body stiffened. The dog moved slowly down the steps, nose low, tail straight behind him, posture controlled but alert. Jack followed. Bear led him around the side of the cabin, then paused at the edge of the brush. There, clear as day in the unbroken snow, were footprints. 2 sets, big, deliberate, moving in a wide circle around the property. Fresh. Jack crouched low, brushing the frost off one of the prints. Tactical boots, not hiking. The pattern was standard issue, military grade. Someone had been watching. Bear nosed further ahead and let out a single, low growl. Jack turned towards the trees, eyes narrowing. No lights, no movement, but he could feel it now. That prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He hadn't felt it in years, not since his last deployment. He didn't like it now. Back inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Jack stoked it again, added wood, then moved to the supply closet and dragged out an old duffel. Inside, 2 field radios, a flare gun, a handful of Claymore trip alarms he'd never expected to need again. "Bear," he said. The shepherd looked up, ears pricked. Jack tossed one of the alarms to the floor. "We're not waiting to get ambushed. Let's set the net." It took them 30 minutes to ring the outer perimeter with wires and snow-covered traps. Bear worked like a veteran, no commands needed. He remembered the rhythm, the spacing, the hand signals. Whatever had changed since their last deployment, the trust hadn't. By the time Jack finished securing the final sensor behind a row of rocks, Bear stopped suddenly and turned his head toward the north slope. A branch snapped. Jack froze. Bear's muscles tensed, every part of his body pulled into stillness like a bowstring stretched to the edge of break. Jack didn't move. The wind picked up again. But then nothing. Just silence. Back at the cabin, Luis was shivering under the thermal blanket. Jack poured a tin cup of hot tea and knelt beside him. "Someone was out there," Jack said softly. They didn't come close. Just circled. Luis's eyes stayed closed, but his jaw tightened. "Maddox's men. They weren't supposed to leave survivors." Jack glanced over at Bear, who sat by the window now, watching. "You served under him?" Jack asked. Luis opened his eyes. "Not like you did." "Just knew his name." When he took over Special Enforcement Division, things started getting quiet. Files went missing. People got reassigned. Then Eric and I caught wind of a trafficking line running near the South Ridge. It was too clean, too organized. You went rogue? Luis coughed. We had to. We started recording meetings, tapping comms with a warrant that no one authorized. That USB, it's got a drop schedule, Maddox's voice, and at least one conversation he thought was off the record. Bear stood suddenly and walked towards the wall near the door. He sniffed, then let out a short bark. Jack walked over, confused. What is it? Bear pawed at the floor, once, twice. Jack crouched, ran his hand over the wood paneling. It felt different, hollow. He lifted a loose board and found a crawl space he hadn't opened in years. Deep, dark, dry. Big enough for 3 grown men. Looks like we have an emergency exit. Just then, the wind rattled the shutters. Bear flinched but didn't back away, his eyes locked on the window again. Luis grunted from behind. They're watching. Waiting for a slip, a phone call, a radio check. Anything that tells them where we are. Jack turned and stared into the fire. He'd come up here to escape people, to find peace. Now, too, broken officers were bleeding on his floor, and someone was circling his home like a wolf waiting for nightfall. Bear sat beside the door again, eyes unblinking. And this time, Jack didn't ask what he saw. He already knew. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was bait. The light filtering through the cabin windows was thin and grey, the kind of dawn that never truly chased the cold away. The fire had burned down to embers, and Jack stirred it with a poker before adding a fresh log. Smoke curled upward lazily, but the tension inside the cabin hadn't eased. If anything, it had thickened. Eric Warner groaned. Jack turned from the hearth and moved to the cot. The officer's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then narrowing sharply as his body reminded him of the pain. His leg was still splintered, but the bruises along his ribs had deepened to an angry blue-black. He winced as he tried to sit up. "Don't move," Jack said, crouching beside him. "You've got a busted femur and a concussion." "Take it slow." Eric blinked, scanned the room, then landed on Luis lying nearby under a wool blanket. "He made it?" His voice was hoarse, dry. "Barely," Jack answered. "You both did." Bear was lying a few feet away, head resting on his front paws, eyes open and fixed on Eric. When their gazes met, Bear's ears perked slightly. No bark, just acknowledgement. Eric swallowed. "You live out here?" "Off-grid, mostly," Jack said. "Didn't plan on guests." Eric let out a bitter breath. "Neither did we." Luis stirred on the other cot, face pale and jaw clenched. "He's awake." Jack nodded. "He remembers anything?" "Enough," Eric said. "The ambush." The sounds. The fact we got sold out. Jack leaned forward. "You both keep saying that. Sold out by who?" Luis turned his head. "The guy who gave us the assignment." Eric finished for him. "Deputy Chief Maddox." Jack didn't flinch at the name this time. "You sure?" "He sent us out to scout a possible fentanyl trail," Luis said, voice tight. "Told us it was low priority. Just a recon check near the quarry path. No backup, no comms." Strict radio silence. Eric shifted slightly on the cot, gritting his teeth. But they were already there. Waiting. Full tactical loadout. Black masks. They didn't shoot to warn, they shot to kill. Jack stood slowly, walked toward the table where he'd left their gear. "One of you had a USB drive sewn into your vest," he said, "hidden in the lining. Who does that unless they know they're walking into something dirty?" Eric's eyes met his. "We weren't supposed to keep it. We were supposed to pass it up the chain, but when we saw the names, the connections, we knew we couldn't trust anyone at the station." Luis added, "It's all in there. Maddox, shell companies, bank transfers, even audio from a meeting he thought was off the books." Bear got up, stretched silently, and walked to the gear pile, sniffing the vests again. He paused at Eric's, circled it once, then sat down with a faint whine. Jack picked up the vest, turned it over slowly, then paused. On the lower inside seam, a small square of thread had been double-stitched, sloppily. He drew his knife and carefully sliced the seam open. Another USB. "You both carried backups?" Jack asked, surprised. Luis nodded. "Redundancy. Learned that from an old SAR guy. Never trust one lifeline." Jack pocketed the second drive and walked to the fireplace mantel. He pulled a small tin box from behind an old clock, unscrewed the lid, and dropped the USB-S inside before resealing it. He glanced at Bear. The dog was sitting upright now, tail still, eyes focused on the window again. Jack's jaw tightened. He's been like that all night. Watching. Listening, Eric looked over. "That's not just a pet, is it?" "No," Jack said. "He's retired SAR K9, Afghanistan, Iraq, stateside disaster response. He's found more people in worse places than I care to count." Luis exhaled. "He saved my life. I remember I was fading out, and something warm pressed against my ribs, kept me here." Jack looked at Bear. He never clocked out, just waited for another mission. The kettle whistled faintly on the stove. Jack poured hot water over a handful of instant coffee grounds, stirred, and handed 2 cups to the injured men. They drank in silence. Then Eric spoke again. Quieter now. We think Maddox is building a transport line through the forest. It bypasses interstate checks and runs straight to logging roads, hidden drop points, tunnels, stashes in ranger sheds. It's smart, Luis added. Too smart for your average street-level scum. Someone with military logistics experience had to plan it. Jack stared into his cup. Maddox. Eric nodded slowly. But here's the part we hadn't told anyone. Not even I, eh? The last guy who looked into this. Officer Brad Hayes. He disappeared 6 months ago. On paper, stress leave. But he never came back. Never even filed the exit forms. Jack turned to the fire. His shoulders stiffened. You find anything of his? Luis hesitated. Not until a few days ago. A contact passed us a sidearm he'd found buried near the southern trail. It matched Brad's badge number, Eric said. We think he got too close. And someone made sure he vanished. Bear growled softly. All 3 men looked at the dog. Jack moved to the window and slowly brushed frost from the pane. Outside, the forest looked peaceful again, but Bear's reaction said otherwise. Someone's out there. Jack muttered. Luis adjusted slightly. If Maddox finds out we're still alive, he already knows. Jack interrupted. There were fresh tracks circling the cabin last night. Military boots, controlled pattern, no rush. They weren't looking. Eric's brow furrowed. Then what were they doing? Jack looked back at them. They were waiting. Bear walked slowly to the center of the room and sat, not in fear, but like a soldier listening for the next order. And Jack realized something then. This wasn't his home anymore. It was a forward operating base. And the war had already come to him. The wind shifted just after midnight. It wasn't louder, just sharper. A dry whisper through the trees, laced with something colder than air. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Jack lay in the armchair with his boots still on, rifle resting across his lap. Luis and Eric were asleep, if you could call it that. Luis tossed fitfully on the cot nearest the door. Eric slept with one arm across his chest like he was still shielding his badge out of habit. Bear was the only one fully awake. The shepherd had moved from his usual post near the window to the back wall of the cabin, ears pricked, body low. His nose twitched once, then again. He stepped forward, toward the far corner, one paw at a time, careful, silent. Jack's eyes opened, sensing the shift. What is it? He whispered. Bear turned his head briefly, then returned his gaze to the wall. Not the window, not the door. The wall. Jack stood, heart tightening. He followed Bear's lead and crouched beside him. The shepherd was sniffing the baseboard now, where dust had gathered around a slightly warped wooden plank. Jack felt along the edge and found what Bear already knew. Hollow. He pried the panel loose with the butt of his knife. Behind it, an old cavity revealed itself, maybe once used for insulation, maybe for storage. Now it was dry and empty. Bear nudged it with his muzzle. Jack understood. He reached for the tin box on the mantel, opened it, and removed both USBs. Then, without hesitation, he tucked them deep into the wall and slid the panel back into place. Bear licked his hand once, then turned toward the front of the cabin. Then came the sound. Snow compressing. One set of footsteps, then another, then a third. Jack didn't move. His fingers curled tighter around the rifle. The steps weren't loud. Whoever was out there knew the terrain, knew how to walk on packed snow without giving themselves away. But Bear knew. Bear always knew. Jack moved quickly, silently. He knelt by the gear locker and pulled out a coiled line of micro-wire traps. Claymores were too loud. These were designed for warning, not destruction. Fishing line tension triggers. A single tug would fire a pop cap loud enough to startle, but not kill. Bear followed him out the back exit, paws barely brushing the snow. Together, they moved in a slow arc around the cabin. Jack set 3 traps, one under the snow between the woodpile and the ridge path, one along the south side near the drainage ditch, and the third directly in the tree line where the tracks had appeared the night before. The air was still, too still. Bear stopped suddenly, his ears cocked back, tail horizontal. Jack looked where the shepherd stared. 3, shapes 50 yards out. Still, watching. They were barely visible through the branches, blurred shadows in the dark. But they weren't moving forward. They were angled like sentries, each with a clear view of the cabin from a different side. Recon Jack narrowed his eyes. These weren't kids screwing around with binoculars. They weren't amateurs either. The spacing, the silence, the way they stood just inside cover. That was muscle memory, military trained. And they weren't moving in. Not yet. Jack and Bear returned the long way. Back inside, Jack checked the windows again. The figures were gone, but the tension in Bear's body hadn't faded. He stood at the window, head tilted slightly, like he was trying to hear past the trees. Louise stirred. "What's happening?" "Nothing yet," Jack said, "but they're not lost hikers." 3 of them, spread in a wide perimeter. Too calculated for freelancers, Eric rubbed his eyes. Why wait? Why not attack? "They want to see what we'll do," Jack answered, "whether we panic. Make a call. Step outside." Louis shifted to a sitting position, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "You think it's Maddox's people?" "Has to be," Jack said. No locals would risk circling a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night. Not here. Not in winter. Bear finally stepped away from the window. He walked to the wood stove and lay down, but not to rest. His ears stayed high, eyes alert, his body ready to spring. Jack sat across from him. He didn't say it aloud, but Bear already knew. This wasn't a random threat. This was controlled pressure. And it meant one thing. The trap hadn't failed. It just hadn't been sprung yet. The next morning brought no relief, just a tighter sky and a stillness too perfect to trust. The storm had passed, but it left behind a suffocating quiet that felt more like a trap than a pause. Jack stood on the porch with a thermos in hand, scanning the tree line. The footprints from the night before had already softened, fresh snowfall covering the sharp edges. But he knew they had been real, and so did Bear. The shepherd had been pacing since dawn, nose pressed low, ears twitching with every subtle breeze. His movements were methodical, not anxious. He wasn't spooked, he was focused. When Jack clipped on his rifle and whistled once, Bear was already moving. Louis, still weak but more alert, sat up from the cot. "You going somewhere?" "Need to check something," Jack said, grabbing his gloves. "There's a frozen creek bed a few clicks west. Bear keeps pulling in that direction. He's trying to tell me something's there." "Want backup?" Jack looked him over. "You'd slow me down." Louis managed a dry smile. "Fair." Eric was still asleep, breath steady. Jack stepped outside with Bear close at his hip. The sky was flat grey, the wind sharp enough to cut. But Bear didn't flinch. He led the way through the trees, heading into terrain Jack hadn't bothered with in weeks. It took 40 minutes to reach the creek bed. The water beneath the ice gurgled faintly, like a whisper through a closed door. Bear paused near a twisted pine, ears forward, body lowered. He sniffed once, then began digging. Jack crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Bear scraped at the snow, pouring faster now, tail stiff. Then he stopped and backed up. A glint of black metal peeked through the white. Jack reached down and brushed the snow aside. A pistol. Standard issue Glock 22. The grip was wrapped in black friction tape, half frozen, half buried. Jack picked it up, brushing off the ice, then froze. Etched just below the barrel was the engraving. Milford County PD 04718. The badge number rang in his head like a bell. Brad Hayes. Jack whispered. 6 months ago, Officer Hayes had vanished. No resignation, no trace. Officially listed as AWOL due to mental stress. But no one ever believed it. Luis had mentioned him in passing 2 nights ago, said Hayes had been sniffing around the same route Maddox later labelled a dead end. Jack stood slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. Bear, you found him, didn't you? Bear gave a quiet grunt, then stepped toward something else. A second object, half buried. Jack followed, crouched again, and pulled it free. A glove. Tactical black. Size large. A rip along the palm where something sharp had torn through. No blood, just the evidence of a struggle. Jack's pulse climbed. The positioning was too precise to be accidental. Someone had tried to bury this, but not deep enough. They wanted it found, or they thought no one would come looking. Bear nudged the glove with his snout, then looked up at Jack, waiting. Jack nodded. We take it back. The hike back was slower, not from fatigue, but calculation. Jack's instincts were firing now. The signs were too clean, too curated. Not sloppy like a cartel drop. More like a cleanup crew that missed a spot. They reached the cabin by mid-afternoon. Inside, Luis was helping Eric sit up when Jack walked in and placed the gun and glove on the table. Luis stared at the weapon like it was a ghost. That's... No way. That's Hayes' sidearm. Jack didn't need confirmation. He's not AWOL. He's not in Mexico. He's in the dirt somewhere in this forest. Eric leaned forward. You found that where? Frozen Creek. West Ridge. Luis looked at Jack. We filed a report 6 months ago. Said he went missing during a solo recon. Maddox shut it down within the day. Claimed Hayes had psychiatric flags and couldn't be trusted with active duty. No follow-up, no search. Jack sat down hard. I served under Maddox once, Afghanistan, different patch, same man. He was a tactician, sure, but a cold one. We lost 3 good men under his command during a raid. He called it calculated risk. I called it something else. Eric stared at him. So you know what he's capable of? Jack nodded. I know what he's willing to sacrifice for the mission. Or for the money. Luis leaned his head back against the wall. That gun means there's no more guessing. Maddox didn't just sabotage our unit. He erased anyone who got too close. Bear walked to the hearth and sat, still watching the window. The faintest growl rumbled in his throat. Jack stood again, feeling the shift in the room. We've got a timeline now. Hayes disappears. You pick up the trail. You're sent into an ambush, and someone still thinks you're worth finishing off. He looked toward Bear. The dog stood now, tail raised, body poised, not tense, but ready. We need to move, Jack said. Tonight. Luis frowned. Move where? Jack's voice dropped. There's an old ranger station up near Signal Ridge. If we can get there, we can send a short-range encrypted signal. No cell tower, but it's patched to a backup government line. Off-grid, emergency traffic only. I used it once after a storm rescue. It still works. Eric hesitated. You think Maddox will be watching that line? I'm counting on it, Jack said. We don't need to hide. We need to flush him out. Bear walked to Jack's side and sat, straight and still, his eyes calm but focused. He wasn't afraid of the coming storm. He'd waited his whole life to run toward it. The abandoned mining site looked like a forgotten scar carved into the hillside, rusted beams jutting from the earth like broken ribs, sagging tin roofs, and decades-old cart tracks swallowed by weeds and snow. Jack scanned the clearing from behind a tree line, his breath barely visible in the bitter cold. Beside him, Bear crouched low, eyes locked on the crumbling shack near the ridge wall. They hadn't meant to move this soon, not with Eric still nursing a shattered leg and Luis limping with cracked ribs. But time had changed its shape. The evidence found with Officer Hayes's weapon had redrawn the lines. They needed more. Something undeniable. Something physical. This is where Hayes traced one of the drop points. Jack whispered, holding the map Luis had handed him the night before. Unmarked shipments. Moved in at night. Sometimes with dogs, Bear didn't move. He was locked in. They crossed the clearing fast, keeping low, ducking under collapsed fencing and skirting exposed beams. Jack reached the shack's door and pulled gently. It opened with a reluctant groan. The air inside was sharp with mold and something chemical. Bear froze in the doorway, sniffed once, then twice, and growled, deep and quiet. He moved toward the far corner, nose to the dirt. Jack flicked his flashlight on and followed. The beam cut across shattered crates and a rusted generator. On the floor beneath a collapsed shelf was a black duffel bag. It had been shoved behind a tarp, barely visible. Bear reached it first and pawed at the side. Jack dropped to a knee and unzipped it slowly. Inside were plastic-wrapped packets, square, tight, and stamped with a black coil-shaped logo. Fentanyl. Maybe a dozen bricks of it. Tucked beside them was something else, a folded map. Jack unfolded it on his thigh. Several points had been marked in red, with one circled multiple times. It wasn't the mine, it was deeper into the state forest, next to a ranger outpost marked C3. Bear nudged the tarp again. Jack turned, pulling it fully aside. There in the dust were paw prints, not Bear's, similar but smaller. The pattern was clear, front heavy stride, right hind leg dragging slightly. Jack crouched, his gut tightening. The prints were fresh, hours old at most. He ran a hand over one of the imprints, noting the pad shape, the claw depth. Another German shepherd, trained, heavy frame, injured, possibly limping. Left behind, or worse, working with someone who didn't care. Bear moved slowly beside the tracks, following them around the room. Then, without hesitation, he sat beside the far wall and let out a low, mournful whine. Jack knelt next to him. You know him, don't you? Bear didn't move. His tail didn't wag. But something in his eyes dimmed, like an old grief stirred. Used to be one of yours. Jack muttered. It made sense. Maddox had once commanded a K9 detachment in Kandahar. Some of those dogs had been retired early, others reassigned without ceremony. What if someone had pulled one of them back? What if someone was using trained war dogs as tools in this trafficking chain? Bear stood and looked toward the door. He didn't whine again. He didn't need to. He had found his evidence. Jack stuffed the fentanyl packets back into the duffel, zipped it, and slung it over one shoulder. The map went into his coat. He grabbed a metal folding chair from the corner, kicked off the rusted legs, and snapped the aluminum bar into a brace for Luis's shoulder. They exited into the wind again, moving toward the trail they'd come from. Halfway back, Bear stopped. He sniffed the air, turned sharply to the left, and darted into the brush. Jack followed. 20 feet off the trail, Bear found it. A collar. Half buried in snow, it had been stripped of tags. The nylon was torn and stiff with blood. Jack turned it over. On the inside, faintly burned into the edge, was a number. K9-Delta 204. Jack's breath caught. He recognized the format. It was military issued. Not local PD, not private security, one of theirs. God, Jack muttered. Bear sniffed the collar gently, then stepped back. Jack placed it into his pack, hands shaking more from anger than cold. It wasn't just about drugs anymore. Someone was recycling K9s into trafficking. Dogs trained to rescue, now used to smuggle, to intimidate, to cover tracks. One of them had been left to bleed out in these woods, and Bear, who had once shared water bowls and sandstorms with dogs just like him, had picked up the trail. As they neared the cabin again, Jack saw smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Luis was at the window, eyes scanning the trees, rifle across his lap. Jack whistled once. The door opened a crack. "Find anything?" Luis asked. Jack dropped the duffel on the floor. "Enough to burn this whole thing to the ground." He tossed the collar onto the table. Eric leaned forward slowly. "That's military." Jack nodded. "And that dog didn't bury itself." Bear lay down beside the hearth again. He didn't rest. He waited. The ranger station sat like a weathered sentinel at the edge of the ridge, its windows cracked and roof half caved in. Years of storms had battered the outpost, but the stone base held firm. To Jack, it felt like the kind of place time tried to forget, and failed. He approached from the southern slope, rifle slung low, Bear by his side. Behind them, Luis moved carefully, one hand on the brace Jack had fashioned from a broken chair leg, while Eric limped behind with a grimace stitched across his jaw. The cold had stiffened everything, legs, breath, silence. Jack pushed the door open with the butt of his rifle, scanning the room with practiced calm. Dust floated through the shafts of pale morning light. Old maps still curled on the walls. A stack of waterlogged ranger reports lay half-buried in the corner. And then a voice rang out from behind the desk. "Drop your weapons." Now Jack stopped cold. Bear growled low, but did not charge. From behind the shadow of a file cabinet, a tall figure stepped forward, Glock steady, breath measured. She was in her late 30s, hair pulled back into a tight braid. Forest green tactical jacket zipped up to the neck, faded letters just barely legible on the shoulder. FBI. "Name," she said, eyes locked on Jack, "and reason for trespass." Jack didn't flinch. "Jack Delaney. These are Deputies Ramos and Warner. They're wounded. We're not here to trespass. We're here because of a signal." Her eyes flicked to Bear. The gun wavered for a split second, and then she breathed his name like a memory. "Bear." The dog tilted his head, ears up, tail slowly swaying. He stepped forward, cautiously, then faster. When he reached her, he stopped at her boots and stared up, eyes bright. Claire Monroe lowered her weapon. "My God," she whispered, crouching. "I thought you were dead." Bear leaned in and nudged her shoulder just once, as if confirming she was real. Jack stepped forward. "You know him?" Claire nodded, brushing her hand over Bear's back, fingers finding the old scar near his flank. "I trained him. SAR Delta Division. He was mine before he was reassigned overseas." Luis leaned against the wall, still catching his breath. "You're FBI. Special Agent Claire Monroe. Tasked with counter-narcotics intercepts. But I've been off-grid 3 days now, following a signal bouncing on a decommissioned frequency." Jack opened his coat and pulled out a field radio. "That was me." Claire blinked. "Encrypted. Old code from a retired channel. Still runs through this tower," Claire stood. "I thought I was chasing traffickers." "I didn't expect to find ghosts." Jack handed her the duffel with the fentanyl packets and the map they'd pulled from the mine. She opened it, took one look, and stiffened. "This logo's come up twice in the last 4 months," she said. "Every time the intel gets close, the investigation disappears. Files redacted, agents reassigned. Dead ends. You think someone inside's burying it?" Jack asked. Claire closed the bag. "I don't think." I know Bear paced to the far window, tail swishing. He wasn't nervous. He was back on duty. Claire moved toward him, opened her own field pack, and pulled out something wrapped in plastic. She knelt in front of Bear. "I kept this," she said softly. "In case." She unwrapped an old K9 tactical vest, black nylon, faded but intact. the nameplate stitched into the side. Bear, SARD 19. Bear stood perfectly still as Claire slipped it over his back and fastened the straps. His body adjusted instantly, posture straightening, breath measured. It was like a switch flipped. He wasn't the old dog on the porch anymore. He was a soldier. Eric leaned forward from the bench. He knows her. Jack didn't take his eyes off Bear. He never forgot. Claire stood. We need to move. You were right to trigger the signal. I intercepted chatter this morning. Maddox is pushing another drop. Different location, different crew. But same logo. Jack's voice lowered. You trust your team? Claire shook her head. No one above field level. I've already been burned once. And the kind of silence we're seeing? That doesn't come from low-level leaks. She motioned to the map Jack had unfolded on the table. This route here, the one marked C3 lines, that's not just a drop zone. That's a full corridor. Luis said, You're saying it runs deeper than the state. Claire met his eyes. Federal, multi-agency level, possibly cross-border. Eric pushed himself up with a wince. Then we're out of time. Jack looked to Bear, now standing near the door, ears pricked, nose twitching toward the open trail. He was ready to move. He'd been ready since the moment Claire walked back into his world. You're back on lead, Jack said to Claire. She glanced at Bear, then back at Jack. No. He is... They left the ranger station just as the clouds began to break, sunlight spilling over the frost-bitten trees. But the warmth didn't last. Something colder was coming. And this time, they wouldn't be running from it. They would meet it head-on. December 16th came in sharp and cold, the kind of morning that burned your lungs if you breathed too deep. Snow had fallen the night before, just enough to silence the forest and leave the earth pliable for tracks. Ridgepoint sat tucked into a crooked valley between two ridgelines like a forgotten outpost. An old logging road, a metal shed, and a clearing wide enough for a helicopter drop. Jack crouched behind a fallen pine, scanning the perimeter through binoculars. Claire lay prone beside him, voice low in his earpiece. No chatter yet. But the thermal blip near the southern slope is steady. Someone's watching the drop zone. Bear moved silently along the tree line, ears rotating like tiny radar dishes. He stopped mid-step and lowered his body. Jack's breath caught. He knew that posture. Bear had locked in on something. Claire clicked the comm. He's found someone. Jack raised the scope. In the high tree beyond the clearing, camouflaged beneath synthetic brush netting, was a sniper. The glint off his scope was barely visible, but Bear had found him first. Luis, 30 yards southeast. Confirm sniper in treetop. Luis's voice came back steady. Confirmed. Target is locked. Waiting on green, Bear slinked forward, paws making no sound against the snow. At the base of the tree, he paused, eyes never leaving his mark. Jack, Claire whispered. You give the word. Jack nodded. Bear, go. The dog launched upward, not at the sniper, but at the tree itself. He struck hard against the trunk, causing just enough vibration to make the man above shift. The sniper panicked and reached to adjust his scope. Luis fired. The man dropped like a rag doll, his rifle hitting the snow with a dead thud. Then chaos broke loose. A black SUV barreled into the clearing from the north trail. Two men jumped out, ARs drawn, scanning fast. Claire rolled from her position and returned fire. Jack moved behind a stone outcrop, his bodycam already recording. Target visual. He muttered into the mic. Maddox is on sight. Bear tore across the snow, weaving through crossfire. A gunman turned, raised his weapon, but Bear leapt first. Teeth locked onto the man's wrist, yanking him down hard. Claire dropped the second shooter with one shot to the shoulder. A third man tried to retreat back to the vehicle, but ran into Jack. Federal agents, Jack said coldly, his badge out, gun up. On the ground. The man hesitated a second too long. Bear was already behind him. He growled once, low, final. The man dropped his weapon. Jack advanced toward the SUV. Behind it, a tall figure in a heavy jacket stepped out slowly. Unarmed. Calm. But there was arrogance in the way he held his posture. "Maddox," Claire said into her mic. "Visual confirmation. He's here." Jack approached with measured steps, camera blinking red. Maddox looked up. "You don't know what you're doing." "I think I do," Jack replied. "You're trafficking product laced with fentanyl, using former war dogs to move shipments across state lines, and you've compromised at least 2 agencies." Maddox smiled. "You have no proof." Jack pointed at his vest. "It's all on here. Including your face. Including your voice." Claire cuffed him as Bear circled back, body heaving with controlled breath. He sat at Jack's side, fur dusted with snow, tail still. Luis came into view, holding the sniper rifle from earlier. "This was military issue," he said. "Laser scope suppressed. That's not street gear." Claire looked at Maddox. "Who's your supplier?" Maddox laughed once, a shallow bark. "You're too late. This drop was a decoy." Jack stepped closer. "Then why were you here?" There was a flicker in Maddox's eyes. Just enough. Bear moved forward, growling again, deeper this time, chest rumbling like a warning from another lifetime. Jack stared him down. "Where's the real drop?" But Maddox said nothing. Claire spoke into her comm. "Team 2, move to secondary checkpoint. Begin sweep." Sirens echoed faintly through the trees. Maddox looked down at Bear. "You brought a dog to a gunfight." Jack replied without turning. "No, I brought a soldier." Bear didn't move, but his presence said everything. By the time backup arrived, the site was secure. Maddox was cuffed, bleeding from a cut on his temple. His men were restrained, weapons tagged, duffels full of synthetic opioids logged and bagged. Jack stood in the snow, arms crossed, as a cold wind pushed through the clearing. Claire checked the footage, already syncing it to a secure satellite line. "This is enough," she said. "Even the Bureau can't bury this." Luis sat on a fallen stump, wrapping his ankle. "You sure about that?" Jack looked at Bear, who was now sitting near the edge of the tree line, watching the woods as if waiting for something else to come. "No," Jack said softly. "But he is." Ridgepoint was quiet again. The storm passed, but they all knew this wasn't over. It had just begun. By January, the courthouse in Ash Valley had become a fortress. Reporters swarmed the steps. State troopers lined the halls. Inside, the trial of Alexander Maddox began with the gravity of a national scandal and the quiet rage of those who'd lost too much already. Jack sat in the second row, stiff in the suit Claire had insisted he wear. Bear lay at his feet, calm but watchful, his body pressed close to Jack's boot. It wasn't just a show of support. Bear was working, reading the room with every breath. On the witness stand, Luis adjusted the microphone. His right hand was still bandaged from the Ridgepoint takedown. Maddox wasn't just a supplier, Luis said clearly. He was orchestrating deliveries through remote counties, using decommissioned military assets, including dogs, to bypass federal checkpoints. He paused, then added, "I was on site during the Ridgepoint operation. If Bear hadn't neutralized the sniper, I wouldn't be here giving this testimony." There was a murmur in the courtroom. Next was Eric, the quietest member of the team, but when he spoke, his words were direct. "I handled the drone footage." We caught Maddox on camera directing the exchange. When agents closed in, he tried to destroy evidence. We recovered the hard drive. The defense tried to discredit the footage, questioning chain of custody, camera angles, even the timestamp. Claire took the stand to put those doubts to rest. She wore her badge with quiet authority, her voice precise, her body still. The encrypted signal we traced came directly from Maddox's satellite phone. We tracked the device across 3 states. He used rogue federal contacts to coordinate airdrops, some under the guise of legal environmental surveys. She turned toward the jury. But what broke the case wasn't just technology. It was Bear. He's a retired search and rescue K9 with years of active field duty. When he detected the fentanyl in the Ridgepoint shed, he saved lives. When he alerted us to the sniper, he prevented murder. A juror wiped their eye. The judge cleared his throat and asked, "Is this the same dog mentioned in the initial report under ID Alpha 9? Claire smiled slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." "That's Bear," every head turned toward the German Shepherd lying beside Jack. Bear looked up. His ears perked, but he didn't move. Not until Jack whispered, "Okay, buddy." Then Bear stood, calm and tall. The silence was complete. The prosecutor rose and entered a final piece of evidence, the chest cam footage from Jack's vest. The jury watched Maddox's arrogance, the men with rifles, the sniper falling, Bear leaping through gunfire. When it ended, the courtroom stayed still for a moment longer than expected. The verdict came after only 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty. All counts. The courtroom erupted, not in noise, but in a kind of collective exhale, a release of fear, tension, and something older, grief. Outside, snow was falling again. Later that afternoon, in the state capital, Jack was called to a small ceremony held in the governor's office. Not televised, not political, just quiet recognition. He stood stiffly as the governor handed him a small box containing the Civilian Medal of Valor. "For bravery, clarity, and service beyond expectation," the citation read. When asked if he had anything to say, Jack shook his head, then reconsidered. "I didn't act alone," he said. "Bear made those choices. Not me." The governor crouched and reached out to Bear. Bear didn't flinch. "I've read about war dogs," the governor said, "but this one..." Jack nodded. He wasn't trained for war. He was trained to save that night. The group gathered at the old ranger cabin they'd used for staging. Claire cooked stew on the wood stove. Luis brought beer. Eric sat on the floor with Bear, letting the dog rest his massive head in his lap. "Feels over," Eric said. Claire shook her head. "It's not." Jack stared into the fire. "We got Maddox," he said, "but someone helped him." Someone inside Luis raised an eyebrow. "You think there's still a leak?" "I don't think," Jack replied. "I know." Claire glanced at the window. The wind had picked up again. The trees outside swayed like they knew something was coming. Bear shifted his head and growled softly. Not at anyone in the room, but at the door. And for the first time since Ridgepoint, Jack felt cold. Not from the weather, from the certainty that they hadn't seen the end. Only the verdict. Justice had come. But the war wasn't over. The morning light came soft through the pines, casting long, golden shadows across the frost-laced grass outside the cabin. On the old wood porch, Bear lay curled in his favorite spot, head resting on crossed paws, his breath steady, eyes nearly closed. His muzzle, once black as coal, had faded into silver. His ears still perked with the slightest shift in the wind, though he didn't bother rising now for every sound. He had earned his peace. Above the front gate, a newly carved wooden sign hung between 2 posts, the letters etched deep and dark. Here, truth was defended by fur and loyalty. Jack had spent all winter carving it himself, not for decoration, but for memory. Inside the cabin, Claire Monroe stood over a bulletin board crowded with maps, names, and schedules. The place that once held remnants of a failed smuggling ring had been transformed into something far different, a training ground. Bear Unit, she'd named it, an independent volunteer K9 team, non-military, non-federal, built from retired handlers, former SAR dogs, and civilians with something to prove, or something to heal. Jack hadn't planned to stay, but after the trial, after everything, he knew leaving wasn't an option. Not anymore. He stepped outside with 2 mugs of black coffee. One he set beside Bear. "Yeah, I know you don't drink it," Jack muttered, "but it feels wrong not to offer." Bear didn't move, just twitched his tail once in slow response, as if to say, "Noted." Claire stepped out behind him, cradling a thick file. "Applications," she said. 24 already. Words gotten out. Jack took the folder, leafed through the names, the photos. Some dogs had scars. Some were too young for combat, but too sharp for pet life. Some handlers looked tired. Others had fire in their eyes. "Good dogs," he murmured. "People too. Bears set a hell of a standard." Jack looked down at the shepherd at his feet. A dog that had survived war zones, drug busts, betrayal and blizzards. A dog that had run through gunfire without a command, had guarded a child's hospital bed without sleeping, had growled at evil before anyone else sensed it. He didn't ask to set a standard, Jack said. He just barked when it mattered. That bark, the very first day, at the edge of that frozen lot when everyone else missed the danger. It wasn't just noise, it was a warning, a call to action, a start. Jack walked to the edge of the property. From the rise he could see the forest stretching out, mist rising like smoke from the trees. Down the road, a black SUV pulled in, a new recruit arriving early. Another dog, another mission. He turned back toward the cabin. Claire was kneeling beside Bear now, brushing his coat gently. She was speaking softly, something only the two of them could share. Jack watched for a moment, then walked inside, opened his laptop, and pulled up a blank document. Title: The Bark That Started It All. He didn't write it to glorify, not for medals or clicks or likes. He wrote it because stories like this should be remembered, because somewhere, someone doubted a dog's instinct today. And maybe they'd remember Bear. He wrote about the cold nights, the close calls, the hidden guns, and the loyalty that never wavered. He wrote about the growl that saved lives and the stare that broke lies. He wrote about the handler who thought he was done, and the dog who proved he still had a role to play. As the sun rose higher, Bear shifted slightly, stretched out one paw, and sighed. Content. A chapter had ended, but the echo of that first bark would carry on in every dog trained here, in every life saved, in every truth uncovered before it was too late. Somewhere out there, another dog was watching the world just a little closer than the rest. And maybe, just maybe, someone was listening. What's your story with a loyal dog? If Bear's journey moved you, helped you see these dogs differently, or reminded you of one who once changed your life, don't forget to support the channel. Like, share, and subscribe to German Shepherd Stories for more true tales of courage, loyalty, and the unspoken bond that changes everything. Because sometimes all it takes is one bark.